we looked at the effectiveness of low-cost electrified barriers for black bears. When we fence a road corridor to keep animals off the roadway and keep collisions from happening, we still have to end the fence at some location. To reduce the likelihood that animals end up in between the fences, you may consider implementing a wildlife guard at the fence end. And the same is true for access roads. We do not want gaps in the fence and allow animals to access the fenced road corridor. When we look at the effectiveness of just wildlife guards, they seem to function quite well for mule deer and white-tailed deer. We look at the left-hand side of the graph, and on the y-axis we see permeability. We see low permeability of these barriers for mule deer and white-tailed deer, meaning they don't cross very much into the fenced road corridor. It's a different story for the right-hand side of the graph. Starting with black bear, another species with paws, there's quite a few of them that cross a wildlife guard and do end up in the road corridor. So wildlife guards work pretty good for ungulates, hoofed animals, but not so good for species with paws. Now, what do we typically do to keep species with paws out of a fenced road corridor? At some fence ends, we may implement an electrified barrier embedded into the travel lanes. But we typically do that only at high volume roads, and there's a high cost associated with it. But what to do with all these low volume roads that need to access the main highway? Typically we install gates, but a gate is a pain. You have to get out of your car, drive through it, get back out of your car, close the gate, back in your car, and therefore many of these gates are left open. So gates in practice don't function very well. When we look at multifunctional landscapes, we see that there's many access points, agricultural fields, dispersed houses. There's many access points. We need a low-cost solution, relatively low-cost solution, to keep animals out of the road corridor, including species with paws. Can we build something for a few $100s, a few thousand, maybe $10,000, something substantially less than maybe a $100,000 or more expensive solution? We also want barriers not to be a pain. So we want them to be drive over or drive through without the need to get out of a vehicle. For this project, we partnered with the Dixon Melon Farm, and you see they grow melons. Most people like melons, but so do bears. The farmer has seen up to 7 black bears at one time eating melons in this particular field. And there's evidence, half-eaten melons, tracks, scat, easily found. An NGO, People and Carnivores, installed an electrified fence around the melon patch. The fence was not designed to keep ungulates out, such as deer and elk. It was specifically designed to keep black bear and grizzly bear out of the melon patch. There's also 4 access points, and this is where gates were installed where vehicles drive through. And this is transportation ecology. We had the opportunity to investigate how well these barriers work in a controlled access environment. On the upper left, we have a swing gate. Now, granted, you have to get in and out of a vehicle in order to cross, but this gave us some sort of a reference. How well does a swing gate work, including one that has electrified wires attached to it? Upper right, we have an easy drive over electrified barrier. If you look closely, there are wires just a few inches above the ground. You can drive a truck or even a not too low by the ground passenger vehicle over this electrified barrier. The lower left, we have bump gates. These are fiberglass poles, and there's vertical electrified wires that hang down from these fiberglass poles. You can drive up to the gate, slowly push the vehicle against these fiberglass rods, and while the rods will kind of glide along your vehicle, you can just drive through without getting out of your vehicle. Then the lower right, a drive-over mat, was installed by Crosstech very recently, and there's no contact with the paint of anything. You just drive over with the tires touching the electrified mat. This is where the melon patch was. The gates are indicated with the yellow markers. There's 4 gates of them, but we also measured the voltage every time we check the cameras, check the voltage of the fence, we check the voltage on the electrified barriers. The results, the swing gate, we had 7 bears approach and none of them crossed. So an excellent performance of a swing gate. The bump gates at first did not do very well. It was barely a barrier to black bears. Most bears walked right in between the vertical strands. It doesn't mean that there's no effective shock delivered to bears. That does happen, as is illustrated by the series of images. Look at the left or the right, and you see this enlarged image of a bear leaving the melon patch with a melon in its mouth. You also see a vertical strand on the nose of the bear. The next image, lower left, the shock has been delivered, the bear jumps in the air and has already dropped the melon. Now, we made a slight modification to these bump gates and we attached these nets to them. The nets have metal wiring too, and now if a bear wants to go through, there's far more contact with its body if it crawls under the netting. Now this made all the difference. We had 19 approaches and none of the bears proceeded into the melon patch. Excellent performance. Drive over wires, not quite perfect, but very, very good. 1 passage out of 34 black bears. The drive over barrier, excellent performance thus far, but we only have a sample size of 2 because it was only installed a few weeks ago. We need more data before we reach a final conclusion. Now, after the 4 gates were made hard or impossible, near impossible to access for the black bears, they started to direct their attention to the fence more. They started digging under the fence, and there was ample evidence of them doing so, including leaving melons. It did require some creative maneuvers, including bear crawl and up bear yoga. Here's a sequence of a bear leaving the melon patch and taking a melon for the road. He crawls headfirst back to the safe side of the fence, the wild side of the fence, and makes sure the melon rolls and collects the melon on the other side and disappears. Now the fences were modified as well, lower wires, an additional wire. One of the wires, which was a ground wire, was made hot. Were also light and sound emitting devices installed to scare the bears away from these locations. From the farmer's perspective, in the first year, there was a substantial reduction in melon loss because of bears, so quite effective. But the current year, it seems that no or very few bears have gotten in. There's no evidence of melons having been predated by bears. There were some operational and maintenance issues. One of the things is that if you have switches on these gates to turn the electricity off, you may forget to turn it back on. What ended up happening after the first few weeks, the farmer said, I'm not ever going to turn it off. I'm just going to tape them in a permanent on position. This way we can't make a mistake. We also found that some of the gates, especially bump gates, can be damaged by vehicles, as is demonstrated in the center image down below. And we realized that we have to have these gates be made more robust. If human safety is at stake along a highway, and if endangered species need to be kept out of the right way and kept from being killed by vehicles, for example, grizzly bears, we need to make these gates more robust. Conclusions. After modifications, the gates were as good or better than the electrified fence, to the point where very few or no bears got to the melon patch, which is a huge attractant. The gates themselves were also a near absolute barrier. The farmer found that 80 to 100% reduction in melon loss occurred in 2020 and 2021. So this seems to support our conclusions that the fence in combination with the barriers are not being breached by the bears. So the concept of relatively low-cost electrified barriers seems proven. But it's also true that some of the gates break, and that shouldn't happen. We need to make these gates more robust. Thank you very much.